We are just in the second week of a new series, go to the end of August, and it is a look at some verses in Philippians chapter 4 that I think give us a good step-by-step guide, roadmap, easy to remember, I hope, way of practicing our Christian faith, growing deeper in our understanding of God and growing more faithful in our daily walk. Let's read together those verses. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. We could live in that last verse, probably, huh? Last week we talked about rejoicing in the Lord always, and about how, depending on the circumstances, that could feel like shallow advice. That kind of advice that's easy to say, but that doesn't really mean much. And yet we talked about, in Paul's own life, how rejoicing in the Lord, even in the depths of a prison, even at the end of a day where he had been wrongfully treated, wrongfully accused, wrongfully tried, and beaten, that rejoicing literally shook the world and shook open the bars of his cage, his jail cell, and brought the Philippian jailer to faith, he and all his household. So it's possible to rejoice in the Lord always, to let our rejoicing lift our eyes and our heart and our feelings out of the present moment, especially if it's a tough one. And remember that we belong to God and that God is with us always, even to the end of the age. Today is a verse that needs a little more opening up. Very simple verse. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. That word gentle in English, in our common usage, denotes something that Paul is not saying necessarily. Often when we think gentle, we think quiet, meek, unassuming, not imposing our presence on someone else, yielding. All of those things come to mind when we think of gentle, and sometimes we don't value that set of behaviors. Laurie and I are big fans of Twilight Zone. I don't know if it's on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's fun. It's amazing what they could do in 1959 through 63 with a couple of cameras and some cutout cardboard things. And the special effects are nothing compared to what we got today, but the stories are usually pretty good. And in one of those stories is about a man who is sick and tired of living. In fact, a lot of these stories have this theme about people being sick and tired of living in the press and the rush and the hustle of today. And he's in a job that's a sales job, and it's a high-powered sales job, and he's a high-powered executive who is in a room full of high-powered executives when all of a sudden news comes that the thing that was supposed to happen didn't happen. And the boss is livid. The boss goes on and on and on, and he tells him, this is a push, push, push business. This is a push, push, push business. You can't ease up for a minute. That's not a room where gentleness lives, right? And there are lots of places where we are where gentleness doesn't seem like the right idea. And so when Paul says, let your gentleness be known to all, that maybe in our minds sounds like something that'd be good for other people to be, but it's probably not going to work in my life. And if you're thinking that, I got good news maybe for you and me. That's not what Paul means. What Paul uses here is a word that describes something that we really don't have a word for in English. Gentleness gets at it a little bit, but it doesn't really catch it the way it needs to be caught. In the ancient world, like our world, there were laws. As far back as a couple of thousand years BC, when we have the Code of Hammurabi from the ancient Near East, which seems to be the first complete collection of laws that we have that describe how a society is supposed to live. All the way up until now, there have been rules, regulations, laws that have to be obeyed. And if they are not obeyed, there are consequences to that. Along come the Jewish people, and somewhere in the 1500s, 1400s BC, they received the law from God. And so this law from God becomes the centerpiece of Jewish life all the way until now. And many, many pages have been covered with writing, and many, many hours of conversation have been filled with people who are meditating and talking about and parsing every word of that law and trying to figure out how it applies in which situation and what it means when it says this or that. The Greeks were familiar with law as well. But one of their philosophers said this, that the law, by its own nature, must be universal. In other words, those who make the law have to make it as broadly applicable as possible. And so the application of the letter of the law can be justice. But sometimes it is more just to fix the law for a particular situation. I feel the tension in the room. Feels like school today, doesn't it? Sorry. Tell a joke, preacher. No jokes, but a story might help. Jesus and his disciples are in a place, and the morning comes, and a crowd is gathered, and in the midst of the crowd is a woman who is bedraggled, maybe not dressed or dressed very poorly. And she's brought to Jesus, and she's cast down at his feet. And the lawyers and the religious leaders, the good people of the town, have gathered to test Jesus. We caught this woman in the act of adultery. Where's the man? There had to be a man somewhere, right? He doesn't show up in this story. That's your first clue something's going on. We caught this woman in the act of adultery, and God's law says she deserves to die. Oh, teacher, what do you say? Now, this is one of many traps laid for Jesus, and this one is a trap in a couple of ways. One, the Romans allowed the Jewish people to run their own affairs, to manage themselves, and their rulers could rule them as long as the taxes were collected and the peace was kept. But the Romans withdrew from the Jewish people the authority to execute a death sentence. The Romans said, you don't have the power of life and death, only we do. So you cannot condemn anyone to death. Only we can do that. And so by bringing this woman to Jesus and casting her down in front and reminding him that God's law, not Roman law, God's law said she deserved to die, what do you say, teacher? They're setting him up. If he says, you're right, the law says stone her, off they run to the nearest Roman magistrate. This guy's telling us to do what we're not allowed to do. You need to arrest him. But it's a trap in another way as well. The law is the law, but the crowd that's gathered, some, maybe more than some, have sympathy for the situation of the woman. Yeah, we know what the rules are, but leave her alone. And if Jesus says the law doesn't apply, the rules don't matter, then the leaders of the people run off and say, this guy's a fake. He's telling us to disregard what God says. Sticky place to be in. So it's a pregnant moment, full of meaning, full of potential, full of tension as they bring this woman to Jesus. And so what does he do? He kneels down, starts playing in the dirt, doodling, maybe pictures, maybe letters, we don't know. Maybe that's a moment where he's collecting his thoughts. Maybe it's a prophetic sign act. And that's something prophets do in the Old Testament. They act out something that God wants them to act out as a sign to the people. Because you see, in the very same law that talks about adultery and that it deserves to be a death penalty for adultery, there's a test if it's a he said, she said sort of thing. And the test is called the test of the bitter waters. And the priest takes water and some dirt and mixes it together and gives it to the woman to drink. If she drinks it and gets sick, then she's guilty. But if she drinks it and is fine, then those who bring the accusation are liable for bearing false witness, and they too can come under a death sentence. So Jesus plays in the dirt. Then he stops. He says, let the one among you without sin cast the first stone. He goes back to playing in the dirt. John tells us in John 8, where this story is found, that one by one, starting with the eldest, the wisest, the crowd that brought the woman and accused her melts away. And finally, Jesus, the one among them without sin, looks up. Where did they all go? She says, none of them stayed. He says, okay. He says, well, I don't condemn you either. Go home and sin no more. This is an example of going beyond the law, of recognizing that a situation that you're in the middle of is not exactly what the law pictured, that this is a unique situation with a unique set of circumstances, and it needs to be dealt with uniquely. Consistent with God's principles, but aware of the circumstances. That's the word Paul is using to describe the way we are to be. Let's call it generosity of spirit instead of gentleness. I think that gets at it a little better. So let your generosity of spirit be so obvious that everyone sees it as a second step in this Philippian way of discipleship. Let your generosity of spirit be what marks you in such a way that people want to know, how did you get to be that way? Probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that many, many people who choose not to go to church choose not to go because they say the church is judgmental. I know that that's hard to believe. And I know that, people make excuses for why they do what they do. And so it's a lot easier to say, I don't go to church because of them church people, rather than to say, I don't go to church because I just don't want to get out of bed. I want to stay home. I don't want to go. So you can adjust that a little bit for some of that, but still in all, we kind of know that that's a thing, that church people can be judgmental. I worked in a big church as an associate pastor, and one of our staff members handled the money and did the bill paying and writing the checks. Real important staff person. She came to work one day, and I noticed that on her ankle she had a tattoo. And so I just commented. I said, "Oh, nice ink." I think that's how the kids say it. I don't know, but. So she came in my office a little later. She said, "Do you think it's okay for me to have a tattoo?" Well, yeah. Why? Well, yesterday at church, she went to a different church. I was told by several people that I was a sinner for having this. I said, well, bless their hearts. You're fine with me. And I think you're probably fine with God. It's okay. If my sons ever listen to this, don't get a tattoo. I don't, your mother doesn't want you to do that. But that's, amen? Amen, yeah, okay. The point being is that even a person who worked in the church had run into the judgmental attitudes that some people in the church have about some things. I worked in a music store many years ago. It's where I met Lori. I managed the store and made sure the teachers got paid, and several guys in the band that I was in worked in the store, and so when things were slow, we'd get a guitar down and practice. So it was a good deal. The lady who owned the store, her family owned the store, and she was the owner. She'd been married to a guy that turned out to be a beast. You don't know some people, they hide who their true nature is. They hide what it is that they are. And so after she got married, she discovered this guy was a bad guy from top to bottom, from in to out. And she was in a miserable, horrible, terrifying situation. And she felt very happy to finally have gotten a divorce and gotten out of it with her daughter. This was years later. The daughter was elementary school age. And she met another guy. And this guy was a great guy. This guy smiled all the time. He laughed easily. He worked hard. He was gentle with my boss and her daughter. He was a great guy to be around, and she hung with him long enough to find out that he was just that guy. That's who he was. And so he asked her to marry him, and she said, yes, I will. And so I was working that day behind the front counter when a stern-faced guy in a suit came in carrying a letter. Asked where she was, office. He goes back. A few minutes later, he comes out, stern-faced, doesn't say goodbye, or as my mom says, didn't say booyakum, just walked out the door. So I go back to see what just happened. And my boss is crying. He was the pastor of the church where they wanted to get married. The church board had met and voted and decided that since she'd been divorced, she wasn't fit to be married in their sanctuary. That's what the book says. Divorce is bad. Yeah, see? That's that time when generosity of spirit is supposed to kick in. When instead of saying, well, I see you at a distance and I see the book and I see the book says you're a bad person, and I don't bother to get to know you. And I don't bother to get to know your circumstance. I don't bother to come to understand who and why and how you are. Paul says we're to be generous of spirit. And perhaps the best story that illustrates it the most is the story Jesus tells of the unforgiving servant or slave who owes 10,000 talents of money to his master, the king. Now, a drachma is a day's wage. 1,000 drachmas make up a talent. So that's 1,000 days' wages, a little over 3 years. He owes 10,000 talents, 30,000 years of money. Now, it's a parable, so you don't ask it too many questions, like, who loaned him that money? How do you walk out of the bank with that? Because that's not really the point the parable wants to make. The point the parable wants to make is that he owed something he could never, ever pay back, no matter what. And the king said, I need to be paid back now. And he said, I can't do it. And he said, if you can't pay it back, I'm going to throw you and your family into prison, sell you off for what I can get for you. And the man falls down before the king and says, oh, please, king, have mercy. And the king relents. And he forgives the entire debt. The man walks out clean. I imagine whistling and maybe skipping down the road when he meets another one of his fellow servants who borrowed $5 last week for lunch. And he grabs him by the throat and he says, you owe me $5 for lunch. And the guy goes, I don't have it to pay it. And the guy goes, you owe me $5. And he goes, I'll give it to you, just give me some more time. And the guy says, you're out of time. And he drags him to the magistrate, and they take him and they throw him in the debtor's prison until he works enough to pay back the $5 he owes for lunch. And the king gets wind of that. And he calls the first servant back in. He says, what's wrong with you? You owed me more than you could have ever paid back in a dozen lifetimes. And I forgave that debt. And you walked out of here clean. And you couldn't forgive lunch money? And so because you're hard-hearted in that way, I am going to throw you in debtor's prison, and you'll never get out until you pay every last cent. Because God has been generous in spirit towards us, has forgiven what we could never work off, has forgiven what we could never make right, has forgiven whatever burdens and debts we carried. Because God has been generous of spirit with us, God expects we will be that way with others. Or maybe demands. Jesus says at the end of the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, you must be perfect in the way you love others, in the same way your Father in heaven is perfect in loving others. Now, all of us have somebody in our life that owes us. Somebody who hurt us, somebody who stole from us, somebody who did wrong by us, We remember. And if you got that in your heart, you may be hearing this morning and saying, well, everybody but that one I can be generous with. I can't let that one off the hook. I can't let that one go. Every situation but that one, I can't be generous with that. Well, the good news is that God's still going to be generous with you. But there's disappointment as God waits for you to grow so that you can do as you have been commanded, to forgive as you have been forgiven, to wipe clean the debts of others as your debt has been wiped clean, to be generous of spirit. When we come to communion today, I hope you'll pay attention to how much it costs God to be generous with us. So that you and I will have no illusions about how much it will cost us to be generous of spirit with others.